Like what you see here? Then be sure to subscribe to Jaguar 8 for the history of college football and Jaguar 7 for the history of Major League Baseball. And now, on with our feature presentation. We could play this sport for 100 more years, and odds are we will never see another coach like Minnesota Vikings legend Bud Grant again. He truly was one of a kind in a plethora of ways, and the stories are just about endless. From the fact that he played in the NBA, to how he helped make Metropolitan Stadium a fortress in the 1970s by acclimating the Vikings to the cold weather to such a degree that they wouldn't even have heat warmers on the sideline, to his tactics and his methods and everything else. There's a reason that Bud Grant, after making it to 4 Super Bowls and leading the Vikings to about a decade and a half of sustained success where they were in a class of their own compared to the rest of their division, is a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I mean, when you make it to the playoffs 12 times and win 158 games, you clearly did something right. And there's a reason, or rather, many reasons, why Bud Grant is considered one of a kind. But of all the stories that you probably heard about how unique and how legendary Bud Grant was, here's one of the crazier ones that you probably haven't heard of before. Think of everything that coaches are supposed to be doing during training camp and during the doldrums of the summer when trying to determine who's going to make the roster. Think of what a head coach has his assistants doing during that stretch, whether it's Bill Belichick, or Andy Reid, or Doug Peterson, or anyone you want to think of. Now, imagine what Bud Grant was having his assistant coaches do in order to prepare for the season. And I promise you, not a single coach before him did it, and not a single coach after him did it. This is just who Bud Grant was. Because this is the story behind one of the craziest coaching methods of Bud Grant's entire legendary coaching career. Before I talk about the crazy thing that Bud Grant did during the 1985 season, we need some context to understand, quite simply, why Grant was even coaching the Vikings in 1985. I'm not going to dive too much into this, because let's be honest, I could do about an hour-long documentary on just how bad the 1984 season was for the Vikings and how terrible this transition was. But to make a long story short, after the 1983 season, Grant, after 17 seasons with the Vikings, plus another decade as the head coach of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers of the Canadian Football League, announced his retirement. Just like that, even though it was only a sample size of 2, the greatest coach that the Vikings ever had was gone, and was going to be replaced by Les Steckel, who served as an assistant under Bud Grant from 1979 to 83, being the team's wide receivers coach. Now, sometimes a transition from one highly successful coach retiring to a newcomer can go really well. Look at the Pittsburgh Steelers of the transition from Chuck Noll to Bill Cowher, or the transition from Bill Walsh to George Seifert. And sometimes, as you can tell from these lowlights, it can be a train wreck like the 1984 Vikings, and can lead to a team completely falling apart overnight. Steckel is widely regarded as one of the worst head coaches in NFL history, as his one-year stint with the Vikings was a disaster. They went 3-13, finishing with their worst record since 1962. They had the 5th worst offense and the worst defense in the league, and lost 11 of their final 12 games. Nothing about this season went right. The players just about revolted, and it was very clear that Steckel was unfit to lead a team. As a side note, to learn more about one of the many losses that the Vikings had during this season, click the card in the upper right corner. With that, the Vikings lured Bud Grant out of retirement, and had him come back for the 1985 season to try and rebuild what Steckel had pretty much destroyed. But there's a funny thing that happened in the season that Grant took time away from the team. There are some coaches that walk away that you can tell are itching and dying to come back. From Sean Payton to Jimmy Johnson to Urban Meyer, you can just tell there are certain guys that when they walk away from the sport, there's a very good chance that they're coming back sometime down the line, as they aren't ready to retire or give up the coaching lifestyle. Bud Grant, on the other hand, not one of those people at all. Not in the slightest bit. He came back to the Vikings because he wanted to make them respectable again. If the Vikings weren't a laughingstock immediately after he left, there was no way he would have returned. The coaching itch was not there in the slightest bit, and he wasn't financially strapped by any means to the point where he needed to coach again. Grant flat out said this himself, saying, "I'm not back in this for myself. I don't like the Vikings being a joke." In fact, Grant absolutely loved the retired life. After being in the sport for over 3 decades, he had no idea what it was like to not live, breathe, and sleep football, saying when he retired the first time, "I've spent every August since 1951 in training camp. August is a blank. I have absolutely no idea of what people do in August, but I'm gonna find out." And sure enough, he realized during his year away from the sport that football was just a small part of life. There was way more to life than just football. Granted, I think Bud Grant knew that already, as he always had a propensity when the time was right to keep it loose. But it was during retirement when he found other hobbies and immersed himself in the world and other activities that he truly realized this. A month before he was lured out of retirement, Grant said, "There haven't been any moments when I wish I was still coaching. I haven't had any dead time. It's nice to say, this weekend, I have nothing to do. I can be like other people." He also added later, after he took the job, on his newfound perspective on life after stepping away for a bit, "Pro football, this business we're in, can seem quite serious. But let's not forget, it's still a sport. It doesn't really mean anything. Nobody lives or dies because of decisions we make. It's not like being in Congress or working as a doctor or airline pilot. We don't start wars or create peace. Let's keep it in perspective." Translation: throughout all of this and his theme going into the 1985 season for everyone involved, there's way more to life than football. But sometimes, when you're young and don't have that wisdom and experience, and you're trying to climb up the ladder to become the next Bud Grant, you don't necessarily realize that. You just get into that routine and stick with it, and immerse yourself in football and nothing else. And when Grant met with his assistants during training camp during that 1985 season, he realized that right away. His coaching staff was a bit too stiff, and a bit too focused on football. Now, in theory, that seems like a good problem to have, right? You have assistant coaches who love this sport and are willing to do whatever it takes in order to win and help out the team, especially after a 3-13 season the year before that brought such embarrassment that it forced the last guy to come out of retirement to fix the mess. What's the problem with that? Well, remember, Grant had that newfound revelation that there was more to life than football, and he wanted to pass that on to his coaches however he could. As Grant said, one coach was so involved, he didn't remember getting up and coming to practice in the morning. That's wrong. Have some fun or you go stale, whatever you do in life. And so, Grant assigned his coaching staff reports. Now, when you think of reports that a head coach assigning to his assistants, you think of scouting reports, or reports of specific players and their strengths and weaknesses, or practice reports. But not Bud Grant, because Bud Grant, in what might be one of the most bizarre coaching moves of his career, decided to assign his coaches geography reports as though they were in school. Here's what happened. There are conflicting reports about the frequency of this. Some sources indicate that Grant assigned these reports every other day, while some sources indicate that Grant assigned these reports every week. However, whatever the case, these reports were frequent, and in each report, each coach would have to write a minimum of 1 page, single-spaced, about what the location was, where it was, and what its significance was. Seriously, this was what Bud Grant was having his coaches do during training camp. The very first assignment that Grant gave his coaches was to deliver a written report about the Khyber Pass. For those who don't know their geography, the Khyber Pass is the point that leads from Afghanistan into West Pakistan, was a point of contention and emphasis during many wars, including World War I and World War II when Great Britain held control, and was a way to facilitate trade between Europe and Asia during the days of the Silk Road. And if you don't want to take my word for it, you can take the word of backfield coach and eventual Chicago Bears head coach Mark Trestman, who wrote about the importance of the Khyber Pass. As a side note, to learn more about Trestman's coaching career, click the card in the upper right corner. But it didn't stop there, because after that, he had his coaches write an essay on the location and the historical importance of Rabaul, one of the central points for Japan during World War II in their battle for control of the Pacific. Japan took over Rabaul in 1942 due to its strategic location, and without the Allied forces eventually bombing Rabaul following some unsuccessful initial attempts, the war, at least when it comes to the Pacific, might have had a completely different outcome. And then, if that wasn't enough, after that, he had his coaches write an essay on Vladivostok, one of the key seaports of the Soviet Union. Vladivostok was one of the most important assets that the Soviet Union had, from its location on the Pacific coast allowing for maritime trade, to its naval base, to the city's location being important for trading with Asia. And Bud Grant had his men write an essay on that. Which raises the question, why? What was the purpose of having his coaches write essays on geographic locations and their significance? This seems like one of those moves where if someone tried it in 2023 of a lesser stature, that it would be widely criticized and mocked. But for Bud Grant, especially after retiring for a year and realizing just how much perspective he gained, this was important. He wanted his coaches to understand the world outside of football, because there will be a day where you're not going to be immersed in this sport, and you might not have anything to look forward to or any real-world knowledge to fall back on. As Grant said, we have young coaches. I want them to learn that there is more to life than football. People can get too wrapped up in this thing and have no idea what's going on in the world. And Grant wasn't kidding when he said that his coaching staff was young, as a ton of guys were under the age of 40. Floyd Reese, the linebackers coach, was 37. Mark Trestman, the backfield coach, was only 29. Dick Ryben, the wide receivers coach, was only 29. And Pete Carroll, the defensive backs coach, was just 33 years old. As a side note, back in 2015, Carroll tweeted this when Bud Grant joined Twitter, and said, "Maybe not as significant as capturing Khyber Pass." If you remember that tweet and were confused as to what he was referencing and whether it was an inside joke or something, well, now you know. It had to do with one of the essay topics during the season. There were coaches who weren't even alive when Bud Grant began his coaching career. And Grant wanted to make sure that these coaches had some real-world perspective, since maybe Grant realized that lesson a little too late in life. So while other coaches around the league were preparing scouting reports on future opponents, Bud Grant's coaches were preparing geography reports. While other coaches were talking about trades, Bud Grant's coaches were literally talking about trading spots. That was just how Bud Grant operated. When people say he truly was one of a kind, and we might never see another coach like him, stories like this are exactly what they mean. Bud Grant had his own unique way of doing things and teaching lessons that went beyond football, and everyone who knew him was better off because of that. Rest in peace to an absolute legend. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.